Welcome to Professor Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Thank you very much for doing all these shiurim with us at Machon Shilo, Dr. England. Dr. England.
My pleasure. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that is one that I think originally attracted my interest when thinking about being a scientist and how the Torah wants an Oved Hashem to relate to the idea of seeking to understand the way the world works through sort of wisdom about nature. And I think that it's a question that we don't necessarily always ask ourselves because culturally speaking, it's kind of taken for granted that Torah both requires wisdom and intellectual pursuit and sort of, and also at the same time is an intellectual pursuit. It describes itself as a form of chokhmah, as a form of wisdom, at least as it is a kind of a knowledge that Mamlechet Kohanim, this nation of priests, Am Yisrael, are supposed to be teaching to the nations of the world. And so it seems like it should be very simple to just say, we're very much in favor of chokhmah, we're in favor of wisdom. Anything that's knowledge of what the world is and how it works, we like it. And then also there's clearly a very strong cultural alignment with this, just as far as the happenstance of Jewish history, partly because of all of the opportunities that Jews sought once they were integrating into a more cosmopolitan and broader secular society, starting several centuries ago. There was a zeal for use of the intellect for Torah that developed inside the more sort of closed off traditional Jewish world over the last several thousand years. And then it started to be applied more broadly. And I don't mean to suggest that before that, Jews were never interested in other kinds of questions about the world, but I think it's fair to say still that the interest of Jewish culture and things like science, for example, really took off a lot in the last 2 centuries, especially in the last century. And then you have these really tremendous contributors to the progress of modern science coming from the largely secular Jewish world, but also, not exclusively secular Jewish world. And so I think it's very easy for us to just say, oh, of course, we're in favor of knowledge, we're in favor of wisdom, and we like intellectual depth. And well, you can't learn Torah from science. Clearly, there's a kind of knowledge of the world that a person who's seeking intellectual depth might like to seek, which will come from scientific reasoning, and that's great, and we should like to do that. But when the other foot drops, I think we still have to ask ourselves, fundamentally, what should be our motivation when we seek scientific knowledge? If you go back to the Rambam, Maimonides, he's famously credited with saying that because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is transcendently not the physical and material world, that the more you understand about the world he created and the way that it works, the more you can understand him by negation of that, right? So Yedi'at Hashem, the idea of seeking knowledge of Hashem, is aided by understanding the world, because somehow the wisdom of the world is sort of this other side of the coin to understanding something about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's a reasonable philosophical position for what it is, but that's one that's quite distinctively the Rambam in its approach. And I think it's not necessarily one that we can so easily directly derive from Tanakh or from Ghazal. And I think that more generally, you could still ask the question almost more vocationally. And this is kind of what got me first thinking about this many years ago, saying, all right, I'm a scientist and I'm going to, let's say, teach science and do research about science at a university. So what should be my motivation in seeking this kind of knowledge? Aside from obviously the need to make a living, right? What else should be what propels you forward? Your curiosity, your desire to make sense of things. Because I think when you think about how scientists and academics, but particularly scientists, style themselves and talk about themselves and why they're doing what they're doing, writ large, meaning not just exclusively within the confines of talking in a Jewish context. You very often hear the idea that knowledge for its own sake is some kind of higher ideal that people are motivated by, or just that the personal desire to know, the burning curiosity, the need to be satisfied by figuring out how something works that just seems like a puzzle where you just have this impulse that you can't put down or you can't satisfy until you somehow see how the trick is done or solve the Rubik's Cube or whatever it is. And then you keep going around the world and looking at it this way and that and trying to find these puzzles and be motivated to solve them. And not only that, but maybe also saying every time you do that, every time you solve a puzzle, it's a win for humanity and it's a win for some kind of ideal that makes the acquisition of knowledge and wisdom about the world just always a good thing, that it's a good for humankind and a good of a more even kind of transcendent and abstract sort to amass knowledge for its own sake or gain wisdom about the world. I think that's a commonly circulated idea. And I think, speaking personally, maybe if you'd asked me, I don't know, between 15 and 25 years ago, how I viewed what I was doing, trying to learn about science, I would have leaned more in the direction of justifying what I was doing that way. But I think if you go into Tanakh now, if you go into our prophetic sources and say, or for that matter, also, see what Ghazal might have had to say about it, and you ask yourself, is this indeed the right kavanah, the right intention, the right motivation to have when seeking knowledge? I think it becomes a more complicated question. And there are a variety of approaches you could take to just pointing out fairly easily why this is going to be complicated. So for one thing, the idea of just acquiring knowledge for its own sake and drawing a circle around that and saying that is a way to motivate one's whole reason for existence in life, that's suspiciously lacking in any kind of inclusion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the story, right? Like it's not saying I have some goal, which is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu according to the Torah, and then knowledge, wisdom, those kinds of things are a means to that service, to that worship. It's just saying it's the best thing you can do is to understand and to plumb the depths of wisdom and knowledge and to understand nature. And it starts to sound suspiciously like not the right kavanah, but maybe a very problematic one, more like a form of idolatry in a sense. And then you think about the ancient world and you realize, well, there were people in the ancient world who made idols out of wisdom, exactly, right? Like the Greeks famously had in their pantheon a goddess of wisdom, and the city of Athens has the same name, more or less, as this goddess, and it was an ideal for their civilization that was pursued, and to some degree we may, to which we may owe the origins of the whole idea of philosophy in the Western context, the worship of wisdom as an end in itself, that you should seek knowledge in order to understand the nature of the world, how it works, what makes it tick, how to do things. And so it's partly about how to gain power over nature and make it do what you want, but also to have some kind of profound communion with it through understanding what it is and making sense of it. Now, clearly, from the standpoint of Torah, if we describe it in those terms, you start to say, well, that's not what you're supposed to be doing, right? You're not supposed to be an idolater who's worshiping the idol of Chokhmah or the idol of wisdom. You're supposed to worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu and serve him. And of course, it might be the case that Chokhmah, wisdom, are part and parcel to that approach, that you're trying to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish for Kadosh Baruch Hu, and maybe you need Chokhmah, you need wisdom for that, but you're not going to make wisdom the end in itself. And we could just leave it at that and say, okay, so there are lots of different forms of idolatry that you could invent. You could make an idol out of love. You could make an idol out of nature. You could make an idol out of peace. You could make an idol out of liberty, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe, here's one particular one. You can make an idol out of Chokhmah. But I think one should maybe go a step further and admit this might be, if not the most tempting idol that you could possibly set up for a genuine Oved Hashem. It certainly must rank very high up there, right? There are forms of idolatry that you could easily dismiss once you have, a halfway authentic idea of what the Torah is trying to teach you about the world, you could look at certain forms of idolatry and immediately see their simplicity and their insufficiency and see them as sort of laughable, right? You could take the vantage point of Yeshayahu and Navi talking about someone takes a hunk of wood and he carves his idol with half of it and throws the other half in the fire, and this is a ridiculous way to behave. But if you're talking about chokhmah, if you're talking about wisdom, this gets very complicated indeed, because at some level, wisdom, to understand the world, seems like in some limit of perfect attainment of that understanding, you perhaps should be reaching the point of knowing the mind of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and relating to him properly. And indeed, if you read Rambam, like in Moreh Nevuchim, you hear notes of this a bit, right? That the Aristotelian way of thinking lends itself to the notion that if you reach perfected wisdom, then at some level, true wisdom should hew in the direction of correct service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the Rambam's view. And so, for example, when he's talking about Gan Eden, and it's exactly what the problem was with eating the fruit, et cetera, the idea of moral correctness or normative correctness in behavior and the difference between truth and falsity is something that he kind of is blending together there, because I think in an Aristotelian view, which is quite a Greek view, in fact, it is difficult to separate ideas of truth and falsity from correctness and incorrectness. And so that is something that should cause us at least to say, we want to look at this a little more closely, because it's not so easy to just say, no, I'm not going to worship wisdom because that's an idol, and I'll forget about it. I'll worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'll keep the Torah, because there's going to be a very steep, slippery slope, even if you're doing the right thing, even if you're on the right path to Avodat Hashem. If seeking certain kinds of chokhmah is part of that, then you're going to always find yourself in this struggle to not get confused and end up bowing down to the wrong thing because of where wisdom is maybe kind of trying to lead you. And so that's going to be, I think, at some level, my main point, the rest of this discussion. And I want to try to prove it with a lot of sources in rapid fire. And really, this might be multiple shiurim, because I think there's a whole expansion you could do on certain pieces of what I'll mention, or things that didn't even make it into the source sheet. But so backing up, with one more prefatory comment, the other thing I would say about, since I mentioned the Greeks before, is that there's something curiously quiet about the concept of Greek civilization in Tanakh. We hear all about Mitzrayim, and we hear all about Canaan. And maybe you would argue we hear a little bit about Hellenic civilization through the prophetic excoriations of Phoenician and other type, seafaring civilizations that are mentioned by, for example, Yechezkel Navi, talking about Tzor, Tyre, and so maybe to some degree they represent that. But given the degree to which Mitzrayim is talked about as a concrete idolatrous civilization that we came out of and got away from, and that we're constantly re-engaging with and interacting with in our history, and given that the Greeks are just over the pond, so to speak, during much of the same period, and let's, going forward further in history, given that the Greeks eventually posed perhaps the most serious challenge to Judaic civilization, and maybe an ongoing challenge at some level because of the devolution of Hellenic ideas through Christianity and Western civilization, it's a bit strange that you don't get more direct mention of this. If we're going to talk all the time about dealing defeat to the gods of Canaan or to the gods of Mitzrayim, or Bavel for that matter, what about all the gods of the Greek pantheon? And I think that may be a longer discussion that we don't necessarily want to take up entirely today. But I would try to start proposing here that maybe part of the point is that, in a sense, it would be too dangerous to do that directly. That, or at least it would be the wrong kind of commentary. That the Tanakh is trying to engage with the ideas that involve a confrontation with Greek civilization and an ultimate defeat of its polytheism and its insufficiencies, or its worship of wisdom for that matter. But that if you are going to engage in that, you don't want to kind of name their gods and immortalize them, and give them, let's say, a platform of their own, so to speak, because we have a much more dangerous slippery slope that lies in that direction, which was ultimately, by the time we get to the stories out of which we get Hanukkah, that clearly becomes the case, right? That Hellenic culture was very tempting to Jews, perhaps precisely because there was so much that seemed to be not so different, that it was going for much of the same things, that you get some of the same results, either from this worship of beauty and wisdom on the one hand, or on the other hand, from Torah. And yet they ultimately are fundamentally divergent views and very methodologically different. So how does Tanakh engage with this question? How would it start to treat this if it's trying to both acknowledge that there's something special about worship of wisdom as being a more tempting and closer to correct form of idolatry, and at the same time putting all the sort of fences and warning signs around it, saying that's what makes it the most dangerous thing of all and we have to be really careful? How would it treat that subject? I think the way we're going to get there is by understanding the idea of the zonah, the idea of the harlot in Tanakh, as being, among other things, an allegorical tool that Tanakh uses to try to react against the idea of a deified notion of wisdom that can be worshipped and served for its own sake. And I think that the reason that this fits is multiple. There's really many aspects that line up here. I don't think it's an accident at the end of the day that the Greeks, when they were worshiping wisdom as a deity, that they chose a female deity, that it was a goddess. Why is that? I think the reason is, first of all, because nature and wisdom are very hard to disentangle ultimately, like understanding the earth and understanding its workings and its patterns that are sort of hidden, and all the sort of secrets that can be unlocked if you understand things about it, all the materials out of which it's made. There's something automatically feminine about the idea of the earth, because the earth is very productive. It gives birth to many things. We are, in a sense, created from it and formed from it and born from it. And so it has a motherly aspect sort of built into the idea of it. And there are other things that you could argue, maybe temperamentally, that people would have liked to associate more with femininity if they were trying to line things up in the ancient world. And I'll say on top of that, though, that there's also, with regard to wisdom, with regard to chokhmah, this aspect of, if I am figuring things out, what am I doing? It's a little bit like saying something was initially secret or not revealed, but because I have the intellect, or I have the capability to understand, that I can uncover it and I can reveal it. So there's this element of uncovering of something that was covered, and doing that perhaps out of not just a curiosity, but let's say a desire to conquer the thing that you're uncovering, right? So if we're thinking in the mindset of Mediterranean peoples of the ancient world, like the Greeks, for example, then if you put together the idea of uncovering nakedness that is trying to remain covered, and doing that sort of through sheer force of your own brilliance, there is, it's in a sense a disturbing metaphorical idea, but I think it's one that appeals very much to the Greek and Roman mind, the idea of sexual conquest as an allegory for, so to speak, scientific discovery. And I think if you look back through various forms of literature connected with the development of science over the ages, you will find there's not a small amount of poetic language that may actually start to evoke those sorts of notions, right? That nature presents itself sort of as a woman to be overpowered, and then for there to be all the productivity and all the enjoyment to be had from that conquest, right? So this in Hellenic and let's say Greco-Roman thought, I don't think it would have bothered anyone to talk this way about treating women this way. Their cultures were very much ones that were comfortable with the idea of rape in various circumstances. And I would argue that Judaic culture sees rape very differently. But so I think that what it's going to do here when we're talking about Tanakh and how it's going to portray wisdom, therefore, is it's going to pick up on this same idea and acknowledge, in a sense, that there is this aspect of femininity to chokhmah, to wisdom, in various passages. But at the same time, it's going to play around with the question of what kind of a woman are we talking about here? Like, there are different relationships to women that one can have in sort of archetypal fashion, laying them all out one by one. There's the relationship of if you're talking now in narrative in Tanakh, there's, let's say, Shechem and Dinah. Shechem rapes Dinah, so Shechem overpowers Dinah. So that's one kind of relationship between a man and a woman. There are also relationships between men and women who are brother and sister, who are husband and wife, between a man and a zonah, who is a harlot that he's paying for access to, whatever aspects of her body or whatever else he seeks. And so there are all these different kinds of relationships to a woman that Tanakh has to play with in exploring this idea. And I think maybe the fundamental one that it is worried about with regard to this temptation of the Hellenic idealization of wisdom and the worship of that is the zonah, the harlot, because that's exactly the one where there's a transaction to be had where it seems like you're going to get something that you want, but it's obviously a transaction that's associated with sin, with doing the wrong thing, and also associated with this nearly irresistible temptation. And then it's all rolled up in this idea of nakedness and foreignness and various things like that. So that's going to be the thesis. And I think there are a lot of sources that I can now call upon to try to support this idea in general. But I think perhaps, ultimately, I want to argue that this is learned from places in Tanakh like Sefer Mishlei, which is, the writings of Shlomo Melech, mostly, and also perhaps from some other parts of the life and times of Shlomo Melech coming from other parts in Tanakh. But perhaps, Ghazal were picking up on a lot of these things and putting them together when they related this passage that we now get through Masechet Menachot in the Gemara. So there's this story that's told of a yeshiva bacher, a student who's a student of Torah with Rabbi Chia, and he's heard of a zonah, he's heard of a harlot in one of the cities overseas. This is during the Roman times. And so he saves up, 400 gold coins and sets a time to meet her. And he goes all the way to meet her, and they let him in, and he presents his sum, his king's ransom for the privilege of visiting this zonah. And then it describes, she arranged 7 beds for him, 6 of silver and 1 of gold. And between every one of them was a ladder made of silver. And on the top, the bed that was made of gold. And so then they sit naked together on top of the bed. But there's this famous event that occurs now where he also is described at the beginning of this Gemara as someone who cares very much about tzitzit for some reason, as the mitzvah of tzitzit is very, dear to him. And his tzitzit sort of smacked him in the face, and he suddenly realized the error of what he was doing. And then it goes on. It's a very interesting passage as a whole. She is so stunned by the fact that he's come this close to consummation of their transaction, and then stepped back because he has this revelation of emunah, of faith. And then she decides to convert. She gives up her wealth, and then comes and becomes a convert to the faith of the Yehudim. And so it's a happy ending. It's a nice happy ending, and one that ends in proper behavior, even though it begins with improper behavior. But I think if I would pick one, so let's say there are 3 elements I'm going to ultimately want to talk about in this particularly. If I want to pick one element to start with that I think is really significant here with respect to all the context I was laying out at the beginning, it would be this. There's something so bizarre about this concept of the story, the premise of the story that's being laid out, because we have this idea of someone who, he's this Talmid Chachamim who's studying with Rabbi Chia. He cares very much about the mitzvah of tzitzit, and he hears about a zonah somewhere and saves up all his money so he can go and visit a prostitute. It's so incongruous. It doesn't make sense. And I mean, the Gemara gives us things a lot of times that seem incongruous, and sometimes maybe you could argue, well, this was a different time and a different place, and some things that sound odd to you, maybe they wouldn't sound so odd to a person of that generation. But I think that we could go for something a little more informative in our explanation here and say, this gets back to this slippery slope I was talking about before. The idea that there may be an allegorical point that Ghazal are really trying to make here. This isn't about a guy who was in all ways this very pious individual, except for the fact that he had this obsession with this idea of visiting this one zonah, but rather that the zonah is chokhmah, the zonah is wisdom, right? The zonah is the idea of nature and wisdom as a woman to be conquered and to be worshipped, to be served. You know, he's making an offering to her of this incredible sum of money. So in one sense, it's service, and on the other hand, it's conquest, because she has this ladder structure of beds. So it's about, you know, it's like the knight rescuing the fairy princess in the fairy tale, which is mythically the same structure that we're talking about here, right? He has to climb all the successive ladders as though he's the one whose might and whose strength are capable of reaching the goal, much like someone who is attaining some pinnacle of wisdom. And there even is this 6 + 1 = 7 thing going on here that's, I would say, even more obvious than usual in Ghazal, where it's just screaming at us the idea of creation, right? That it's not just she had 7 beds, she had 6 beds of silver and 1 bed of gold. And so there's this notion of 6 + 1 = 7 means that we're talking about the created world as a whole being represented here, with Shabbat being the special extra day that's different than all the other ones, and also representing this idea of the ultimate unattainable transcendent thing, right? Because Kedusha, Shabbat is kadosh, it is separate and special and different in the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is separate and special and different. He's kadosh, 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 right? He's many levels of transcendence above everything else. And so she is selling in this transaction the experience of feeling like you've climbed the whole mountain, you've gotten to the top, and you can see everything from the top, because now everything at the top is uncovered. There's nakedness, it's all exposed. It's also gold, so it's, you know, the ultimate achievement of worth. And so it's this very rich emblem of all of these elements that are pointing at this idea of, let's say, I would argue the Greek and Hellenic version of idolization of wisdom as the highest goal to attain, or the highest deity to serve. So that's one thing. That's a second thing that we can notice, this 6 + 1. But then I think the last thing that's a little curious is the involvement of tzitzit. What does this all have to do with tzitzit? Like, in one sense, we can say, and I have this source further down, but you know, those who recite Shema twice a day know this by heart. So we say, when we see the tzitzit, it says, "Vaya lechem tzitzit uritam oto uzachartam et kol mitzvot Adonai v'asitem otam velo tatu acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem asher atem zonim achareim." So you're supposed to see the tzitzit, and when you see them, you remember all the mitzvot of Hashem, all of Hashem's commandments, and that will keep you somehow from straying and going after all the things that your heart and your eyes take you towards. But the verb there is zonim, right? That you go whoring after these things that you see. So it's connected, at least at that level, that in the Torah itself, there's some notion of znut, of seeking harlotry or prostitution, as being the thing that tzitzit are guarding you against. And worshiping foreign gods is the usual go-to for the explanation of what that means, what kind of debauchery that is supposed to consist of. But I think here that's the reason that tzitzit get involved in this passage from Ghazal. But now we can have to go back in Tanakh and say, Ghazal are distilling something from many passages, I think, in Tanakh in order to build this for us and relate it to us. So how do we make sense of this viewed through the lens of Tanakh, and what more can we understand there? So now I think I'll just try to put out data that I think support the notion in various quarters that this idea of chokhmah is associated with, let's say on the one hand, the idea of conquering a goal that is feminine so that you can expose nakedness and satisfy some desire. and therefore the association of that with perhaps not just a woman, but perhaps a zonah, but then the unwillingness of the text to fully go that way and just say, Chokhmah is a zonah, stay away, right? Because if Chokhmah truly were just a zonah, truly were just a harlot, then you would just put a big warning sign around it and say, this is, like many things, not kasher, and so we do other things. We don't do that. Of course, the problem with that would be is that we need chokhmah. Chokhmah is very important. It's part of Avodat Hashem. So we can't just say, ignore it. We're concerned with things that don't involve understanding what the world is and how it works. That doesn't work either. That's why it's a particularly dangerous form of idolatry, because we can't just leave off it and forget about it. Although many other forms of idolatry, you might argue the same thing about them, but perhaps this one most of all. So just reminding us of a few different passages that we can bring in that now seem to evoke this idea. So first of all, Yosef. Who is Yosef? Yosef is the son of Yaakov. He's famously described in the Torah as being very chacham. Paro calls him navon v'chacham. Ein navon v'chacham kamocha. So there's no one else who's so wise and so clever like Yosef. Now, what happens to Yosef in Mitzrayim? He gets involved with this very powerful woman, this foreign woman, who is trying to tempt him into a sexual affair. And we think usually of this being something where Yosef is the tzaddik because he runs away. And so we don't focus too much on what might have been tempting to him about it. But she manages to get a hold of his shirt, which is more than nothing, right? So there's a question of to what degree he came close to making the wrong decision. And Ghazal play around with this in Midrashim. But in any case, it's the idea of a foreign woman who is offering some kind of sexual encounter, and that's associated with Yosef, who's very chacham. If we go to someone else who's very chacham in Tanakh, it's the friend of Amnon, the son of David, whose name is Yonadav. And this, I think, is the best proof text in Tanakh that chokhmah is not simply a good thing. That you shouldn't just say, go get as much chokhmah as you can. Doesn't matter. It's just always, a great kiddush Hashem or a great service to humanity to be chacham for whatever purpose. Yonadav is described as being an ish chacham meod. He is the friend of Amnon, and Amnon is going to ask him for some advice, and it's going to be very good advice. And Amnon's question is, how can I successfully rape my sister, Tamar? And Yonadav gives him exceptionally good advice on how to achieve that. And then Amnon is successful. So if we want a clear example where chokhmah, genuine chokhmah, can be used for perversity and sin and calamity and all these things that we think of as being very bad, this is perhaps the best place in Tanakh to go looking for that. I'll mention also, so clearly, Amnon, he's not just someone doing something bad with chokhmah, he's trying to rape his sister. So this is again about desire, curiosity / some other kind of overpowering desire to satisfy what he cannot satisfy before he uncovers nakedness. And this is all wrapped up with Yosef because Tamar wears a ketonet pasim like Yosef. She wears a striped garment like Yosef. Her name is Tamar, which is the interlude in the story of Yosef that's about Tamar and Yehuda, where Tamar dresses up as a zonah and Yehuda goes to visit his friend Chira. And then while he's there, very much like in Menachot, he does this very curious thing where he just says, okay, I'll go visit a zonah now. And it's very puzzling to us because it seems like, well, if he's someone we think of as a paragon of emerging Judaic morality, then why is he going and visiting prostitutes? So it's incredibly intricately intertwined, where the name of Tamar appears in the story of Amnon, the son of David, but that's referencing another instance where there's another uncovering of nakedness that has other elements of this idea of a tempting woman who sort of stands there in the case of the first Tamar at the crossroads and presents an opportunity to someone who ultimately, we think of as being someone we trust to make good decisions, maybe, and he's going to go down the slippery slope because of how this opportunity presented itself to him. So there's a lot you could make out of how to connect all these different passages, not to mention the fact that David, the father of Amnon, comes from the original encounter between Yehuda and Tamar back in the day, and so these texts are heavily referent to each other. But one last thing that I'll mention, which will get us over to Shlomo, is that this person Hira Ha'adulami, Hira the Adulamite, is this friend that Yehuda was visiting when he goes and meets Tamar in Timnah. And I think the point there is that Hira is this notion of foreignness also. It's not just about the tempting woman. It's also this idea that there's a foreign element, an idea of foreign culture, because foreign culture is naturally associated with wisdom, because wisdom is universal to humanity. And also the foreign cultures of the Mediterranean were very much into wisdom. And Ghazal pick up on this in the Midrash and say that Hira, the Adulamite, was the same guy as Hiram, who later helped David and Shlomo build Beit HaMikdash by sending cedars from Tzor, from Tyre, down to provide the wood for making the Mishkan, etc. And so there is this notion of foreign powers and friendship with foreigners also being wrapped up somehow in this possibly dangerous encounter with the zonah, or possibly dangerous encounter with wisdom associated with the idea of satisfying one's desire to uncover the nakedness of the world and sort of explore the hidden depths of what we don't know yet, because we haven't managed to climb the ladder, so to speak, or overcome the challenges presented to us. So all that was a whole lot to lay out at once. I think for the other, let's say, main chunk of texts that we want to now refer to, it all has to do with Shlomo. So there are different things about Shlomo in Malachim, and also in Mishlei, quotations from Shlomo and Mishlei, and that will get us ultimately to Beit HaMikdash, which is where this has to land in some sense. So Shlomo HaMelech is the son of David, and he is the other person in Tanakh that you would say, that we associate with Chokhmah perhaps more than anyone, because he was so great in his Chokhmah, so great in his wisdom, that everyone came from around the world to ask his advice. And we have this passage. Did it make it into this text, or maybe it didn't? So, or maybe I think I have a very short portion of a passage. Let's see, it's in Melachim. So, oh, maybe, yeah, here we go. So Malkat Tzva, the queen of Sheba, is famous for visiting Shlomo and hearing about all of his wisdom from afar, but then coming to see him and finally talking with him and realizing that, yes, he's the wisest who ever was, and giving him all this gold. And so this pasuk here that I have, Vatomer el HaMelech, emet haya davar asher sham'ati be'artzi al dvarecha ve'al chochmatecha. She said to the king, the report I heard in my own land about you and your wisdom was true. There's a whole lot more in that passage, but what it ultimately lands in is that they have this very cozy relationship with each other, where they're sort of telling each other secrets. And then immediately after that, the place that the Navi turns in describing what happens is telling us about how Shlomo went off the path, right? That he eventually is not just the one we remember for building Beit HaMikdash, but also the one we remember for turning towards idols. It says, "Vayi la'et ziknat Shlomo neshav tu et levavo acharei Elohim acherim velo haya levavo shalem im Adonai Elohav ki levav David aviv." So in his old age, his wives turned away Shlomo's heart after other gods, and he was not as wholeheartedly devoted to Hashem as his father David had been. So what is the implication here? David also had lots of wives, one must acknowledge, but he mostly didn't have foreign wives. So maybe the foreign element here is being emphasized more. But there's still in any sense, this idea that the relationship between a man and a woman, when it's like that of a husband and wife, or something, let's say worse than that, like between a zonah and her client, and also when there's this element of foreignness, that is pointing in the direction of the slippery slope, that even Shlomo, who was so chacham that he was the one who built the first Beit Mikdash, the first temple in Jerusalem, that he somehow couldn't resist the danger of falling into all these idolatrous practices that were imported with all of these foreign women that he got involved with. And when we read this as children, so to speak, it just sounds like, oh, that's a shame. It's too bad he couldn't have just built Beit HaMikdash and then not gotten involved with all these foreign women, and then he wouldn't have gone off the derech, so to speak. But I think that really what we have to view this as is, especially talking about Shlomo, this is not something where he just took a wrong turn one day. He sort of snapped and did something totally out of character. On the contrary, I think what the text is showing us is that he was so chacham, and being so chacham contains this tremendous danger. Because if you are that chacham, then you are always on the brink of having a flawed relationship, so to speak, to the foreign woman, which is this emblem of chokhmah that you have already so nearly conquered through your intellect. So Shlomo needs to be chacham in order to build Beit HaMikdash. And that's quite clear in the text, and we can get into that in a second. But the fact that he is so chacham is very blended in with and inseparable from the danger of the temptations of chokhmah to lead in the wrong direction, and eventually to lead to various forms of idolatry. And I think what's remarkable is now when we look at texts from Shlomo, we see that writ large. First of all, he's the author of Shir HaShirim, right, which is a lengthy text that is viewed by many as a genre of erotic poetry in some sense. And you could step back from that and say, well, what is Shir HaShirim really about, and what is he trying to say? But at the end of the day, you can't get around the fact that it sounds like a song of one lover to another in many parts. And why would Shlomo be the one to be talking that way? That's very much in character now with the way that we're talking about him. The same way that Kohelet is in character, that if he's so wise, he also experiences a lot of philosophical ennui, that he's weighted down by all of the kind of seeming futility of what he appreciates about the patterns of the world. So Kohelet and Shir HaShirim are both very detailed expositions of different aspects of the danger of great chokhmah. But if we look in Mishlei gives the most considered analysis by Shlomo himself of the danger of having too much chokhmah, specifically with respect to this idea of the alien woman. So this is introduced, for example, in Mishlei Parak Zayin, which is one that is in the middle of a series of passages that are talking about wisdom and the use of wisdom, but keep likening it to a woman. And there's one pasuk I'm quoting here. It's a long passage, so we can't go through all of it, but it's very interesting, and I recommend taking a close look at it. It says, Emor lechokhmah ahoti at, umoda'a levina tikra, lishmarcha meisha zara, minochriya amereha hechlika. So say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding a kinswoman. She will guard you from a forbidden woman, from an alien woman whose talk is smooth. So what Shlomo is saying is, look, chokhmah, let's say chokhmah is a woman. And elsewhere we see, for example, in Mishlei, and I think we had this in a previous shiur, chokhmah really being likened to like a girl playing at Hashem's feet, that nature and wisdom are sort of like this feminine character where the world is her plaything, so to speak. And it's a very beautiful passage, and also a very troubling one from the standpoint of polytheism, unless you read it with the right kavanah. But if you look at this point that Shlomo is making, he's just saying this: if we talk about chokhmah as though she's a woman, do not seek to relate to chokhmah as though she's a woman you can marry, or a woman you can pay for one night, so to speak, or any of the other kinds of relationships of that sort that would involve an uncovering of nakedness. Relate to wisdom, relate to chokhmah as your sister, which is to say, you can love your sister and you can spend time with your sister, but there are boundaries that are very clear, that are set in how you're able to relate to her. Ones that Amnon, for example, crossed and transgressed. And those boundaries are very important because of the danger of some other kind of perversity that would result from no boundaries confronting the temptation that one experiences when facing the beauty of wisdom and all the curiosity that it produces. And if we go elsewhere in Mishle, we can see the sort of opposite side to this, which is that if you have this relationship, then Chokhmah is a treasure. Happy is a man who finds wisdom, and her value is greater than either rubies or pearls. But Yikara hi mitpninim, which is very interesting because we know from every Shabbat reading Eshet Chayil that we also have elsewhere in Proverbs, Eshet Chayil mi'imtza v'rachok mipninim michra, that her price is far beyond that of either rubies or pearls. So the point is that all of Eshet Chayil, in a sense, you could read as an allegory that's about nature or wisdom as a woman who's doing all of these things. Interestingly, when you finish that with Sheker Chen v'Hevel HaYofi, that grace and beauty are lies in emptiness, Isha Yirat Adonai Hiti Talal, it could actually be in contrast to the Eshet Chayil. It could be saying, don't worship wisdom. That you want an Isha Yirat Hashem. You want a woman who is fearing of Hashem, and she's really to be praised above this sort of deified wisdom woman who is up all night weaving and lighting all the candles and doing everything that wisdom can do for you, that having all this power and capability. So I'll just say in general with Mishle, there's so much in there that is exploring this idea. And the main passage, I think, from Perek Gimel to Perek Chet or something like that, you cannot distinguish where it stops talking about Chokhmah as a woman with positive attributes and where it starts talking vividly about the dangers of an Isha Zuna, an Isha Nochriya, a dangerous harlot, a foreign woman who tempts you and says, my husband is away and come and pay the price. And the reason that boundary is so unclear is precisely because I think Shlomo is saying this is one woman, and you have a choice about what kind of relationship to seek. And Chokhmah can present a very significant danger to you if you seek it for its own sake, instead of trying to pursue it with the right ends in mind. And what are those ends? That's where we should be trying to finish this up. So what is Chokhmah for, right? If Chokhmah is not something we can do without, but at the same time, it's also something that presents tremendous dangers, then what is the Torah's ideal for how it should be applied and why we should be seeking it? So there, I think the place that we can go to is Sefer Shemot. So the main other place in Torah, in the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, where we see the largest number of references to Chokhmah is in the making of the Mishkan, is in the making of the tabernacle that will be at the center of Beit HaMikdash. Because Chokhmah ultimately is about understanding how the world works enough to get it to do things that you want it to do. For example, if you need to make a bowl out of metal, or if you need to make a candelabra out of some other metal, or if you need to weave yarn together and dye the yarn before you weave it together, those are all things where there's a way of knowing how to do them well that can be studied and scientized to some degree and developed as a craft and as a technique. And once you have that knowledge, it lasts because it's the way the world is. You have uncovered something about the world that you previously didn't know, and now you can take that to the bank. And the point is that those same crafts and capabilities are the basis for any human civilization, right? That they allow you to build tall buildings, they allow you to make airplanes, they allow you to communicate on Zoom, like we're doing right now. So Chokhmah can be applied in many different ways, but the emblem of the best application of Chokhmah that the Torah presents to us is with Moshe and Betzalel and Oholiav and all the different people who have the Chokhmat Lev, the wisdom of their heart, to give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu what is needed to create a home for him in this world so that we can worship him. ויקרא משה אל בצלאל ואל אהוליאב ואל כל איש החכם לב אשר נתן אדוני חוכמה בליבו, כל אשר נשאו ליבו לקרבה אל המלאכה לעשות אותה. So it's the idea that Moshe is calling on Bezalel and Oholiav and every skilled person that Hashem gave some skill, which was really wisdom of their heart, as it's written in the Torah, to excel in that ability to do a task for the creating the Mishkan. And I'll also note in the same passage, more or less, a little bit earlier, there's a specific reference to weaving. And weaving is quite interesting if we're talking about the Hellenic idea of worshiping wisdom, because their deification of feminine wisdom was also in their mythology associated with weaving. And here we have in this passage in Shmot, the description of, and all the skilled women spun with their own hands and brought what they had spun in Chelet, Argaman, V'tolat Shani, right? They, blue and purple and crimson yarns and fine linen. And all the women who excelled in that skill spun the goat's hair. That's the translation here in English. Now, I will just point out, and I don't want to make too much out of this in this shiur, and in general, I don't want to belabor too much the need for thinking about the ideological systems or narratives of other cultures of the ancient world when trying to understand Torah, but it is notable that there is a word in this passage, which I'll let any who want to go and dig for, which more or less sounds read in ancient Hebrew like the name of this Greek goddess that we've been talking about. And the point is not at all, chas v'chalila, to suggest somehow that the Torah is affirming that idea. I think it's more the opposite, that it's showing how deeply it wants to bury the idea of the Greek pantheon underground, right? That the danger of the Greeks was that they were so successful with their worship of Chokhmah that it was very hard to say that they were totally wrong about everything, because they were worshiping something that in another sense is a very universal currency. Chokhmah can be had by all humankind and can be used for all sorts of purposes, and we need it to serve Hashem. That is what the Mishkan is teaching us. We need Chokhmah, and we need lots of it in order to be successful Avdei Hashem. However, we can't accept their way of relating to Chokhmah as an end in itself to be worshipped, and so much so that we refuse to even talk about it. But there are these little hints that in the Torah that it's telling you this is a discourse, a sort of an argument that it is very keen to make very fiercely, and that it's aware of all of the elements of that argument, to such an extent maybe that you can even notice through plays on words or through selected elements of imagery reference to the ideological system that the Torah is trying to disrupt and make forgotten. So I guess I'll stop there, and maybe we can discuss for a few minutes. But those were the main things I wanted to try to get through today.
Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, Aharon, or please, Avi, I guess was first, I think.
I very much enjoyed the lecture. It was really great.
Thank you.
It's the first time I'm listening to you speak. I actually wanted to hear you for quite some time, but I just didn't get the opportunity. And today I got the opportunity, and I very, very thoroughly enjoyed it, and I very much want to thank you for that. I just had one question. When you said that he was referring to the Greek deity as a hint in I think you said in Shmot, did I catch that correctly, or did I miss that?
Yeah, well, I don't want to belabor that point, because obviously resemblances of words can be coincidences. In this passage, it's hard for me not to notice it. It's source number 7. And I also feel uncomfortable, especially in the context of teaching Torah, but in general, calling in the names of deities that just as soon should be forgotten. So I won't mention exactly what I'm referring to, but I think without too much effort, if someone's curious, I think there's a word in here that is suspicious, in reference to that, especially given that it's also talking about the centrality of wisdom to worship of Hashem, and also weaving, and also women, and also the fact that they're doing something that's connected with Shlomo, who in turn is rolled up in all of this
Okay,
other temptations.
I now got it.
Yeah.
I now read the reference. That's very, very tantalizing. Thank you again very much. Very much enjoyed this. It was very, very
My pleasure.
meaningful.
I just wanted to understand what will be the conclusion on wisdom, because what I understood was that it could be not very positive, like to have a lot of wisdom. Like it was a little bit confusing and contradicting. I don't know what's the conclusion of it.
Yeah, so I'll try again to try to be more succinct in summarizing what I think is the point. I think the point is that chokhmah, wisdom, is something we absolutely need in order to do the job that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us. We cannot say that we don't seek wisdom and we don't want it, because it is at the center of creating the Mishkan, of creating the place for his worship in Yerushalayim. And I don't just mean that in the narrow sense. I think the narrow sense is usually neglected, and it's an extremely important one. Like, we actually need to know how to weave things, for example, right? And I think it's a shame that Am Yisrael do not spend more of their time developing the chokhmah to do the melachot that will be needed in order for us, B'ezrat Hashem, to make a Mishkan and all those things, because it actually requires knowledge. And it's not the knowledge that you get by getting a degree in electrical engineering or whatever else these days. That being said, I think it's also true more generally, right? That Avodat Hashem, if you think of the Mishkan, if you think of Beit HaMikdash as an emblem, a physical instantiation of the general relationship HaKadosh Baruch Hu seeks for us to have with him, then what he is saying is, you need to learn a great diversity of different kinds of chokhmah about the world, and your motivation for doing that should be that it will be part of how you serve me, that it will be your way of keeping the Torah better and being a more successful Oved Hashem. So if you're going to ask yourself, why should I seek this chokhmah? Is it going to be just because I'm curious and I enjoy the thrill of conquering new heights of satisfaction of my curiosity? Or is it going to be because I hope that by gaining this chokhmah, I will have a new perspective on how to be more successful as an Oved Hashem, or I'll have new powers and new skills that I can dedicate to that. And I don't mean that it all has to flow back to making woven tapestries that are going to be placed on one hill in Yerushalayim. That is an extremely important aspect, but it's not the only one. But I think if we try to abstract a little bit, we can say that the part of the purpose of the Mikdash is to teach us the proper relationship to Chokhmah, and also I would argue, and this is a separate shiur, to beauty. Ghazal said about Beit HaMikdash, someone who never saw Beit HaMikdash never saw a beautiful building. And I think the whole idea of aesthetics, what is beautiful is something that has been so visually beautiful, has been dormant in Judaic culture for thousands of years to a large degree, because we haven't had a Mikdash. And we found it easy to say, well, that was for the Greeks. The Greeks worship beauty and we don't. But it's more complicated than that. The same way it is with Chokhmah. Chokhmah and Yofi, wisdom and beauty, are things that we should be leading the world in, but we can't lead the world in unless we are anchored properly with our dedication of them to Avodat Hashem, and the Mikdash is the key to that.
Thank you. So basically, you're saying that we need all aspects, and if we only have one, it's incomplete, and it could lead to very wrong things. Is that correct?
I don't think it's not only about many aspects. It's also about what is the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal of a worshiper of the Greek deification of wisdom would have been, so to speak, to commune with the goddess of wisdom by achieving understanding, right? So that the ultimate goal is wisdom for its own sake. And then there are these kind of side benefits of that. That actually is how many scholars describe their motivation, especially, if you go further back in time. And the point is that is a form of idolatry, and that's not service of Hashem. Service of Hashem requires seeking Chokhmah, but we don't seek Chokhmah as an end in itself. We seek Chokhmah as a means to serve him better. And there are all sorts of Chokhmah that we can seek with that in mind, whether it's about, I don't know, building nuclear weapons, or whether it's about, weaving, or whether it's about understanding economics or whatever else. There are many different kinds of knowledge that we can seek. But the question is, what's the intention of the Oved Hashem? What's the intention of the Jew, the person who's doing the understanding while they're trying to improve their chokhmah? And that will ultimately have a huge impact on where that leads, and whether it leads to a positive place or an ultimately deviant one.
Okay, thank you.
My pleasure. I think we had to cut this one short today, right? So we probably better get going.
Okay, yes. I think you're definitely right that there's a lot more to discuss.
Yeah, so
I think the things that I would have liked to say now, which I won't say now, also connects to upcoming shiurim, B'ezrat Hashem.
Definitely, B'ezrat Hashem. Thanks very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, and good evening, everybody.
My pleasure. Kol tov.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.